Hi, welcome to this AQA A-Level Business revision video looking at 3.4.2, Analysing Operational Performance. In this video, we're going to be going over the formulas and measures of looking at how well our operations department is doing. As a quick reminder, my teaching here is separate from my teaching and consultation roles at any and all of schools and academies around the country. My name is Mr. Giles. Let's get down to business. So as explained in my setting operational objectives video, the operations department are the doers. They're the people who actually carry out the service, the production, whatever it is this business does. And it's imperative that we're able to measure their performance. Now, there is a bit of crossover between, say, operations and human resources and even finance when it comes to measuring. And this will just continue to add to the formulas that you are required to know. Now, the formulas are asked more often in year 12 papers as raw formulas, but you're expected to use them in year 13 without being prompted. So make sure you're secure in these formulas and watch this video back enough times to really master these. There are essentially four ways that you can measure the performance of our operations department. There are probably more, but these are the four that I feel that are more likely to come up and are the best kind of bang for your buck. The first one we have is capacity utilization. Then we have average unit cost, labor productivity. And then lastly, I've put waste/quality because it's one formula. You don't often have to calculate it, they just give it to you, but it can tell you one of two things. It can tell you about the wastage or the quality, depending on how you look at it. We're going to jump into each of these and kind of do a worked formula approach so you can see how it breaks down and then explain what the results actually mean, because that's probably the most important part. So first up, we have capacity utilization. And this is arguably the most popular formula they ask for operations and probably the most useful. And all we do here is you can see this formula here, I've just abbreviated. So capacity utilization is your actual output, i.e. how many units per year, it's usually per year, but week, month, whatever, how many units you're actually outputting divided by your total capacity. Now, total capacity is how many units your factory could produce. So you might have a factory, for example, here that could produce 110 units, but your actual output is only 75. So just without doing the maths, you can see that you're not utilizing all of the space and resources that you have. So if we do the formula here and we divide those two numbers and times it by 100, we arrive at 68.2%. So we as a business are utilizing, i.e. we are using roughly 70% of the potential of our production facilities. Now, there's two ways of looking at this because I feel like my immediate reaction to that would be, that's not good. There's two ways of looking at this. Number one, if you're not at 100%, you are wasting resources. And remember in my operations objective video, I explained that waste encompasses time, money, and resources. So if you're trying to minimize waste, okay, if that's your objective, minimizing waste, 68.2% is a disaster. That's not good because that means 30% of the time you've got workers stood around doing nothing, you've got machines doing nothing, or worse, there's 30% of your entire building that is not being used how it should be used. All right, now it's wasted dead space essentially. The other way of looking at it, if you aren't trying to minimize waste, is that 30% of the time your workers get to socialize. And that could be positive for their motivation and their mental health. 30% of your machines are getting a rest. So they're not getting overused. So they're less likely to break down. And there is 30% spare capacity should you suddenly see a surge in demand. So if you suddenly saw a 20% increase in demand overnight, you could meet it because you've got that spare capacity. So what we say for capacity utilization is 100% is dangerous because you can't respond to changes in demand and you're overworking things. If a machine breaks, you're knackered. But anything kind of less than 80 is seen as a bit wasteful, if we're perfectly honest. So this 70% still isn't great. Really, we want to notch it up to 80%. But maybe you just don't have the demand for 80% right now. And there's a few things we can do. First and foremost, we could make some people redundant. So if we know that 30% of the time our workforce is stood around chatting the breeze, we could fire 10% of them. And that way, the rest that stay, the 90% that stay, have to work a little bit harder. And that would bring our capacity utilization up. We could decrease the size of our building or rent out a piece of our building. I'll give you a really anecdotal example of that. My local gym is huge. My local kind of like warehouse gym is huge, in a big, massive warehouse. When I say huge, it is huge. And there's just not enough customers to fill that building up. So they built a big studio in there and they rent it out to the local Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club. So they knew they weren't going to utilize all 100% of that building. So they just built a studio, and now that is being utilized by a whole nother business. Really good use of the space. Okay. So there's doing that. And then the other bit is to, well, actually, instead of kind of trying to fix it, why don't we try and increase demand? Because if we can produce more, maybe we should produce more. And that is a big kind of corporate decision to be made there. Now, on the other hand, if you are working at 100% capacity utilization, why is that tricky to say? 100% capacity utilization, then you might want to then increase the size of your building. Okay, because we don't want to be sitting at 100%. That's dangerous. You're going to overwork people. So that's the measure of capacity utilization. Up next, we have average unit costs. And this is essentially a giant measure of economies of scale. Now, if we think back to our operational objectives, this is probably where we're going to be looking at, say, cost minimization or waste minimization, something like that. And if you are producing anything, you are looking for some sort of economies of scale. Now, if you're producing en masse, you want maximum economies of scale. If you're even, producing high quality items, but still on some sort of scale, you still need to get some sort of benefit from that. It's only really those really custom one-off bespoke items that will get any sort of diseconomies of scale, essentially. So, first of all, we have the formula. The formula is very simply total cost divided by output. Now, before we go any further in this video, if you don't understand these words and numbers here, you need to go all the way back in this playlist, if you are in the playlist, or you need to go back on my channel and you need to find the Unit 1 video that discusses all of these numbers. You need to have a really secure understanding. Otherwise, the next 2 minutes of your life are going to be really painful. Okay, so pause this video and go watch that one if you don't know what total cost, variable cost, and all that kind of stuff is. Okay. So down the side here, I've got output 1, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The total capacity for my business is 10,000 units. That's the most my business could produce. Now, the fixed costs for my factory are £15,000. Wonderful. So regardless if I produce 1 or if I produce 10,000, I have to pay my 15 grand. We all know that. Great. My variable cost per unit is £3. So each unit costs me £3 to make. So if I make 1 unit, it costs me £3. If I make 10,000 units, it costs me £30,000. Wonderful. Then I get my total costs. And all I did was add these two together. Bing, bang, bong, we can see down here. Okay, so at 10,000 units, my total cost is £45,000. That makes sense. At 1 unit, my total cost is £15,003. So that 1 unit I produced is bearing the load of all of the costs of the business. So average cost is when we take the total of all of our costs and divide it over the total of all the units that we outputted to see how much each unit has to bear. Now, as you can see here, the average cost at 1 unit is that 15,003 because there's only 1 unit. So that poor unit is having to kind of take the bear of all that whole costs. So if you were going to price that 1 unit to make a profit, you'd have to price it at £15,004. So I don't know what that is, but it has to be worth £15,000. However, if I produce 10,000 units, my average cost is actually only £4.50 per unit because I'm able to spread my fixed costs out over multiple units, and then they've only got to take on board their own individual variable costs. So again, I've taken my total cost, which was 45,000, and I've taken my output, which is 10,000, and merely divided them. Okay, unfortunately, 15,003 divided by 1 is still 15,003. So those average unit costs are really important because this is a clear representation of economies of scale. So if we link that back then with capacity utilization, why do I want my business running at 80% plus? Because the further down this output list I get, the more I can spread out my costs, the more flexible I can be with my prices. So right now the cost is £4.50 all in. I could price this product at £5 and make 50 pence profit per product. And maybe £5 is a really competitive price. But if I didn't reach 10,000 and I maybe went to 10,000 and I've got to start charging £19 for each product to make a profit, maybe that's a really uncompetitive price and people won't buy it. So average unit costs, any questions on that one, straight in the comments, please, folks. Labour productivity is a cheeky one because it technically belongs in the human resources module, but we pick it up and drop it in here because it still looks at units produced. So the formula is here: labour productivity equals the output of the business, so that total output, not capacity, output, what they're actually making, divided by the number of workers that made those units. And there's no multiplication here. It's not a percentage, it's a raw number. So if I go back down here, let's go back to my business that has 10,000 units. So I'm producing 10,000 units, and let's say that I've got 500 workers. Each worker would be producing 20 units. Now, there's multiple things we can do with this number. First of all, we could set that as a quota for each of our workers, and we could use it as a kind of performance review for them. So any worker that isn't producing 20 units might be asked to leave or given some training. Or we could use it as some sort of ranking system. This is done by unethical businesses where they say, well, look, we've got Max over there who makes 30 units, and then we've got Elliot over there who's only making 10. So we're going to pay Max more. That might incentivize Elliot, or we're just going to ask Max to produce more, offering more money and sling Elliot, because paying someone overtime is far cheaper than paying Elliot's whole wages. So you could do that with it. The other way of doing it is looking for underperforming employees. So if you have got a Max and Elliot situation, a 30 and a 10, you then might go to Elliot and say, well, hang on, look, why can't you produce 20 as a minimum and 30 like Max? And then they'll go, well, you know, blah, 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 excuses, whatever. And then maybe some training will happen there. The other way of looking at it is seeing whether or not that your workers can produce more. And what you do is you add this formula to capacity utilization. So in our previous example, our capacity utilization was roughly 70%. So imagine our labor productivity was 20 units. That's how many, on average, how many units each worker was making. But we're only working at 70% capacity utilization. That means that our workers could produce 30% more. So they could actually be producing 26 units in the time span, whether that is week, year, whatever. They could be producing 26, but they're only producing 20. Because remember, they're only working at 70% capacity. So we could then know that if we needed to squeeze more of our employees, we totally could. And then the last thing is you could then link this to some of the HR kind of bits and look at, well, hang on, what is that doing to my average costs in terms of my wages? Because again, if I could squeeze 6 more out of each one, I might be able to fire some workers, squeeze the extra 6 out of the other workers, and that would reduce my total wage bill. So that's labor productivity and how hard our workers are working and how many units they're actually producing. And lastly, I said we would look at, say, wastage and quality and combine them together. This is the concept of the defect rate. Now, I've never actually seen them ask you to calculate this, but it doesn't mean they won't in the future. But we're looking at what percentage of our products are being made defective, i.e. they're not being made to the quality standard we're after. Now, sometimes they give this to you as a percentage when they're asking you to compare 2 different factories, for example, or sometimes they just give it to you as a raw number. So the amount of products that have been made that were defective, right? And then they will give you the total output. So all we do there is do the divide. So how many defective units were there? Divided by the total output of the business times by 100, and that gets us our lovely percentage here. So I'm going to carry on with our business that has a 10,000 unit output, and I've just made up that we've got 800 units in that time frame that were defective, that had to be thrown away. So that would give us an 8% defect rate. So I took the defects, divided by the total output, and then times by 100 to get the percentage. So imagine if I told you that a business is producing its entire yearly quota of products and it has to throw away 8% of them. It doesn't sound very good, does it? Now, there's 2 ways of looking at that. You could say, well, actually, that there's a lot of waste in that business. It's wasting a lot of raw materials, time and money because it's throwing away 8%. Or You could say, well, maybe it's got a really high standard for its quality control, and that's why it's throwing away 8% because it doesn't want to let poor quality items leave the production line. There's an even further way of looking at that and saying maybe these workers aren't very good because they're creating 8% wastage or 8% defects. So maybe our workers need some training in order to upskill them to stop them making so many mistakes. So there's lots of different ways we can wrangle that. Whichever way you want to look at it, it's the higher it is, the worse it is. And it's a really good measure of whether or not the operations department is doing a good job. So either it's got a lot of waste or not a lot of waste, or it's got high quality or low quality. And again, if it's low defects, it's probably higher quality, right? Because it's being made to the appropriate standard. So those are our 4 measures of operational performance. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments down below, and I'll make sure to get to them as quick as I can. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. You stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.